Okay. Um, so welcome to a new course, and thank you to those who asked about studying Psalms. I appreciate the fact that you have created extra work for me, and but that's okay. And I really mean this because, well, maybe not appreciate the extra work, but I appreciate the opportunity to dive a little bit more into the Psalms because, despite the sort of general belief that rabbis are or should be experts in all facets of Judaism, um, most of us really, if it is a psalm that doesn't appear in the Siddur, we likely don't know it. Uh, and That's all the more so for Orthodox rabbis whose training has nothing of Bible. My training had 2 semesters of Bible. And interestingly enough, I mean, my undergraduate mentor was a Bible scholar, and I really anticipated doing lots of Bible electives in rabbinical school, and the first semester of Bible convinced me that that was the last thing I wanted to do. Having said that, and what we learned, we did not learn a lot of Bible. What we learned was Bible study methodology. In other words, how to study Bible. But in terms of the actual content, very little. I will sometimes say, when I went to rabbinical school in the early 1880s, and somebody will say, well, don't you mean the early 1980s? And actually, no. I mean, the methodology had not changed since the German universities of 100 years earlier. Um, and really, it was a lot of grammar, and a lot of linguistics, and very little attention. And in fact, even if you asked a question about like the meaning of the text, not what it meant for people 2,500 years ago, but what should it mean for us today, that was not what we were doing. So this is an opportunity to dive into that a little bit. So, I don't flatter myself that I'm going to teach you anything. We're going to learn together. Um, Let me just look at a couple of things about what we're going to look at. Okay, so first of all, what is the book of Psalms? Right? What is the book of Psalms? In Hebrew, it's known as Tehillim. Tehillim means praises, but um, there's a lot more than just Psalms of praise. Okay. And, it's not, and here I can say something that sounds heretical, perhaps, without actually being heretical, right? I mean, the traditional belief about the Torah is that it is a unitary composition, right? Whereas I believe it was written by people, although they were inspired by God, but they were people. over many, many centuries, but that is not the traditional belief. But nobody believes that the Book of Psalms is a unitary work. I mean, it is quite obviously written by different people. In fact, the Psalms are attributed to different people right there in the Book of Psalms. And they reflect different historical times, different events, different intended usages, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so it is really better to describe it as an anthology rather than a book. What they all have in common is that they are poetry or song lyrics, if you prefer. They were meant to be sung. And if you look at the texts, and I'm talking, of course, about the Hebrew text, and you might read them and say, how is this poetry? I mean, I think you could say the same thing about almost all poetry that has been published in English since sometime in the 1960s, right? I mean, we used to think that poetry had rhyme and meter, and now it doesn't have to do that anymore. But the main characteristic of biblical poetry doesn't rhyme, right? The main characteristic of Hebrew poetry is parallelism. Okay, what parallelism means: expressing roughly the same idea in two different ways, right? In two different phrases, right? So I should have thought up an example of parallelism before the class, but something like Lord, grant the Capitals victory, yea, let them defeat the Sabres, right? That would be an example of biblical style poetry, right? The same idea, but in like two different ways. Okay, and apparently our ancestors thought that that was really cool, and that that is the main characteristic of biblical poetry. Um, and the other thing that you can tell, I mean, most of you would not be able to tell, but I can look at a biblical text. I mean, I don't have the expertise to say this was written in the 13th century BCE as opposed to the 10th century BCE, right? But I can look at it and say, oh, yeah, that's really, really old and archaic Hebrew, whereas this is like more recent, okay? And literary biblical scholars will tell you that the oldest parts of the Tanakh are poetry. Doesn't mean that everything that's poetry is the oldest part, but everything that is the oldest part is poetry. And why is that? I mean, you can tell by the language, but there's also a much more sort of practical reason for that. Okay, is that these texts were originally transmitted orally, right? And think it. I mean, how many? Right, we all know by heart the lyrics of hundreds of songs. right? Without even making an effort, right? I mean, every song that was in the top 10 when you were, in high school, um, you still know by heart, right? Um, and so poetry or song, song is easy. And the Hebrew word for poetry or song is the same word. It's shira, right? That's easy to remember. Okay, so um, it makes sense that the oldest texts are poetry. But I at least can look and say, oh yeah, that's really like archaic Hebrew. Whereas this would be another text would be more recent. Um, and here, I mean, Psalms really are central to Jewish prayer, right? I mean, we all, right? I mean, it was the last thing we did um, in the service tonight, or the last thing that we do at Myriv, right, is Shir Shalom, right? The Psalm of the day. Hayom Yom Rishon. Today is Sunday. Shabo Hayu Haliviim Omrim Bevet Hamikdash. Right? Today is whatever day of the week on um, on which the Leviim, the Levites, would sing in the temple, right? So there was a daily psalm, um, but also like Ashrei. Ashrei is Psalm 145, and Ashrei appears in, you know, it appears in Shacharit, it appears in the Torah service, it appears in Mincha, right? I mean, if you daven the full what you're supposed to, you're going to say Psalm 145 three times a day. Um, on certain holidays and on Rosh Chodesh, we sing Hallel. Hallel is Psalms. It's Psalms 113 to 118. Um, there are other more spiritual uses for Psalms. Um, very common if somebody's ill to pray Psalms for them. It can be just starting the book of Psalms from beginning to end. It could be selecting certain Psalms, but and frankly, I mean, historically, saying Psalms for the recovery of someone who's ill, that was particularly a women's practice. Um, but also, you may be familiar with the practice of shmirah, right? That when somebody dies, traditionally we do not want to leave them by themselves, right? So either people will take turns doing shmirah, or if that can't be done, somebody could be like hired to do shmirah. And what does the shomer or the shomeret do? They sit with the body and they recite psalms. Okay, so it is, a really like key kind of spiritual practice. And because they really express the full spectrum of human emotion, right? I mean, one of the things that I mean that I think is key to relating to the Bible as a spiritual text and not just as a historic text, is to find yourself in there, right? In other words, who am I in this story, right? Whatever the story may be, right? The Akedah, right? Who am I in the Akedah? Am I Abraham? Am I Isaac? Am I Sarah, waiting at home, not knowing what's going on? Am I the two servants who accompanied Abraham and Isaac? Am I the donkey that carried the wood up the mountain with them? Am I the ram, stuck in and all of those are like legitimate answers, right? But who am I in this story, right? And it's the same thing with Psalms. The Psalms aren't stories, but like, what emotion am I feeling? What emotion am I feeling? And what is a psalm that expresses that same emotion? Okay. I mean, I mentioned to those of you who are in the other class I teach, I know many people who pray Psalm 109 every day for our chief executive. Okay. I don't want to look at 109 now. If you're not familiar with it, right, take a look at it later, right? But it contains the line, may his days be few and may another take his office, right? May his sons be orphans and his wife be a widow. Yeah, and that's in the Bible, okay? Right? And, so, yeah, Leslie.
Well, I just want to suggest if people are interested, you can get this book on Amazon. It's not expensive. It's the Book of Psalms. So, I mean, you could, refer to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly easier than like Svaria, but I mean, Svaria is cheaper because it's free. But either one, and it doesn't matter like what, translation you use. Okay, so there are having said that, right, there are different different types of psalms, okay? They are, I mean, different scholars will characterize them differently, but we have hymns or psalms of praise, right? They extol God's greatness, power, God's work in creation, God's work in history. They often include a call to worship, the reason for praise, and a concluding statement of praise. Okay, there are psalms of lamentation, expressing sorrow, suffering, distress, a plea to God for help. They can be individual or communal, and they often, but not always, move from an expression of pain to a statement of trust in God, and then sometimes a vow of praise, right? Like, these terrible things are happening to me. God, please rescue me. God, I know that you will rescue me. And when you rescue me, I will praise you in the gates. Okay, something like that. Songs of thanksgiving, gratitude for deliverance, for answered prayer. They'll often recount the problem and then the way God intervened. Okay, there are royal psalms dealing with the king's coronation, and We often understand them like also messianically, right? I mean, like a text does not necessarily have to have only one meaning, right? It may have a meaning in its original context, but that doesn't mean that that's the only way we can understand it, right? So if we read about, I mean, say, well, with Pesach, right? I mean, why is the eighth day of Pesach? Um, the Haftarah is a messianic Haftarah, right? And Hasidim on the eighth day of Pesach have Su'udat Mashiach, right? The Messiah's banquet, right? I mean, what does Passover have to do with the Messiah, right? The Passover, the Exodus, is a paradigm of the ultimate redemption, right? So we can read a psalm about the coronation of the king. And yes, originally it was about David or Solomon or Saul, but that doesn't mean that that's all it can mean. We understand it to mean the coronation of the Messiah eventually. Okay, there's wisdom psalms that offer instruction on how to live a righteous life. And they often share themes with other wisdom literature like Proverbs or Job. There are what's known as songs of ascent, okay, Shir Hamal. Okay, I mean, we're all familiar with like Psalm 126, which we tend to call Shir Hamalot, but actually there is a whole collection of 15 Psalms, Psalm 120 to 134. They're all sort of captioned Shir Hamalot, a song of ascent, which were traditionally recited by pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem for the Hagim. They often express themes of hope, trust, joy of going to the temple. And why would songs that we sing going to the temple be called Shir Hamalot, the song of ascent? All right. How many of you have been to Israel? Raise your hand. Okay, not enough. But what can you do? How do you get to Israel? I mean, how do you get to Jerusalem? You ascend, right? No matter where in Israel you are coming from, right? You ascend to Jerusalem, right? Oh, right. It's called Aliyah L'Regel, right? Um, Aliyah, ascent, going up. L'Regel means by foot, right? But the Shalosh Regalim, right? Right? Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot are known as Regalim, right? Pilgrimage festivals, okay? So there's songs of ascent. Now, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? They can have, two or three, you could like legitimately fit them into more than one category. Um, actually, I learned something in preparing for this class that I didn't know. Okay, I mean, I learned a lot of things that I didn't know, but this is like mamash, I didn't know it. That the book of Psalms is structured into 5 books. Okay, um, corresponding perhaps to the 5 books of the Torah. Okay, and each book, all right, so there are 5 books, and each one of them concludes with, I'll teach you another $5 word, a doxology. Okay, what is a doxology? A doxology is a hymn of praise. Okay, it doesn't have to be a hymn, but it is praise, right? I mean, if you look at, and this is, you know, ironic, right? I mean, people often think of the Kaddish as a prayer for the dead, when of course it is nothing of the sort. Um, what it is actually is a doxology. It is praise of God, right? So, book 1 is Psalms 1 through 41. These are primarily Psalms of lament, focus on personal struggles, the path of the righteous and the wicked, expressions of trust and God. Many of them are attributed to David. Okay, and the doxology is at the end of Psalm 41. Book 2 is 42 through 72. More Psalms of David, but also Psalms of the sons of Korah, Mizmor Livnei Korah. Continues with themes of lament and trust, but also a focus on community and the kingship of God. Psalm 72 is also a doxology. 73 to 89 are not attributed to David. They are attributed either to Asaph or again to the sons of Korah. Grapples with difficult questions regarding the justice of God, the suffering of the righteous, the Davidic covenant, often expressing deep lament. Questioning the doxology is the end of Psalm 89. Book 4 is 90 to 106, begins with the only psalm attributed to Moses, Tefillah Moshe Ish Elohim, Psalm 90. Shifts in tone toward praising God's eternal nature, his reign over creation, and his faithfulness to Israel despite our unfaithfulness. A collection of psalms proclaiming God as king. Psalm 106 is the doxology in book 4. And the last book, 107 to 150, diverse collection, thanksgiving, praise, ascent, emphasizes the importance of God's word and culminates in a grand chorus of praise to God in the final Psalms 146 to 150, with Psalm 150 serving as the ultimate doxology for the entire collection. Okay. Let's see. So all right, so right, there are a lot of different psalms, and I had here a breakdown of who they're attributed to. Okay, so depending on how you view certain psalms, there are between 73 and 80 psalms attributed to King David. So around half, 12 psalms attributed to Asaph, 11 sons to the sons of Korah, 2 Psalms attributed to Moses, to Solomon, 1 to Moses, and 1 each to Haman HaEzrahi and Eitan HaEzrahi. Okay, and around 50 Psalms are anonymous. They lack any specific attribution to a particular writer, but as I said, it is an anthology, and that's self-evident, right? The Psalms of David are the earliest part, and as along with the Psalms of Asaph. The Songs of Ascent are later, or at least some of them are, as we'll see. And so, that's just like a kind of quick and dirty introduction to the structure, the authorship, the function of the Psalms. What I propose to do, for the rest of our study group, as long as we choose to meet, is look at specific Psalms. Okay, I didn't know, I usually speak longer than I anticipate. Today I have spoken shorter than I anticipated. And you can consider that a blessing or a curse, as you will, but so I only actually prepared 1 psalm that I wanted us to look at. But I would suggest, if there are particular psalms that you want to look at, send me an email and say, I really love this particular psalm, or I've always been curious about this particular psalm, and we'll, look at it. And it doesn't have to be in any particular order. I'm not going to say, well, you want to look at Psalm 75, but we're already on 83, so we can't go back. Yeah, Leslie. Yeah.
I'm wondering, as everybody has access, if they don't have a book like this, they have access in the Humash for because I think it's better if everybody looks at the book at the same time, rather than you putting on the screen putting it up on the screen where we can't really see each other, and we can't really read it together and that kind of thing. Just a thought.
That's fine. That's fine by me. I mean, look, everybody has a Tanakh. I mean, I shouldn't assume, but I assume that everybody has a Tanakh in their house, right? And so if you have a Tanakh, unless it's the Reader's Digest version, the Psalms are in your Tanakh, and it doesn't matter what translation in particular. In fact, I mean, it's often interesting to look at different translations, and compare them. I mean, just for example, right, the 23rd Psalm, right, which everybody learned as a kid, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, right? Which sounds as if you're talking about, I am forbidden to have a desire for things. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That is not at all what it means, okay? And I'm not giving you some hippy dippy new age BS here when I say that is not what it means, right? Because the meaning of the text is not determined by King James, right? It is determined by the Hebrew text, right? And the Hebrew text says Adonai ro'i lo echsar, right? Lo echsar means I lack nothing. Okay, now I shall not want at the time of the King James translation meant I lack nothing, right? Like FDR's right for freedom, freedom from want. Freedom from want doesn't mean freedom from desire, it means freedom from lacking, right? So the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want was a very good translation of Lo Echsar in the 1600s. The English language has changed, right? So if you say I lack for, I shall not want, it's not a good translation of Lo Echsar anymore. And it's not because King James's translators didn't know what they were doing. It's because King James's translators did not have the power to prevent the English language from changing. Right. So, that's it having said that, there is no modern translation that has the poetic and linguistic beauty of King James. Right. And so as a work of literature, it's great. As a way of conveying what the Hebrew text actually means, it's no longer that great. Okay, so yeah, I mean, so that would be really cool if somebody brought in, the King James as their translation, and then all right. So, um, the psalm that I wanted us to look at tonight was Psalm 126. All right, so if you have a book, you find it. But since I don't assume that everybody does, I'm going to do a screen share. Okay. Most of you probably know this, right? I mean, we sing it on Shabbat and Hagim uh, prior to Birkat Hamazon. Okay, and now what I am going to do, I'm going to do a fairly deep dive into the Hebrew, and you'll see why. Okay, so, right, I'm not going to sing, right? Shir Hamalot Beshuv Adonai Et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kehomi. Okay, Shir Hamalot, a song of ascent, right? So this is, we believe that this was written for pilgrims to sing as they were going up to Jerusalem to the temple on the festivals, right? Now, one thing that I mean, you may like already know this or know it even though you don't know that you know it, is that that tense in Hebrew is flexible. Okay, and it is not always clear whether this is meant to be past, present, or future. Um, and you actually know that, right? Like ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, right? If you learned Hebrew, if you learned enough Hebrew in Sunday school or Hebrew school, ahavta is in the past tense. You loved, right? But ve'ahavta, nobody says, right? You loved the Lord your God with all your heart, right? The way I learned it, the way Janet learned it, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, right? Um, so we read it as a command, as in the future, right? But right, so text is fluid. Okay, so Beshuv Adonai et Shivatzion Hayinu Kahomi. I would translate this as when the Lord when the Lord restored the return to Zion, which doesn't make any sense. So when the Lord caused us to return to Zion, Hayinu Kahomi, we were like dreamers, right? But here, this translation has it in the present, okay? But it's also possible to read this as in the future, all right? Although even though Hayinu is the past tense, but you could read it as the future, okay? And which one is right? I would say all of them are right, okay? Because there's the historic meaning and then the subsequent meaning, right? So, but it is pretty clear that this is a reference to a historical event, and that is right, because it even that phrase, Shivat Sion, the return to Zion, right? What is the return to Zion that this is talking about? The end of the Babylonian exile, right? When Cyrus allowed the Jews, and it's proper to talk about Jews by then. I mean, a lot of times we say Jews when we really should be saying Hebrews or Israelites. But by then they were actually Jews because they were from Judea. Um, and Cyrus the Great allowed the Jews to leave the Babylonian exile and go back to Zion. Okay, so that's the contemporary meaning, right? But am I interested in praising God for something that happened, you know, what, 2,500 years ago? Not so much, right? It's also an expression of hope for the future, right? And that's why we sang this over hundreds of years of exile, right? I mean, it's now complicated by the fact that we don't really need to pray to God to bring us back to Zion, right? We can simply go on Expedia.com and buy a one-way ticket, right? But having said that, that's not Israel's important. It's not messianic redemption, right? We're still longing for that messianic redemption, right? And so the point being, right, is that language is fluid and flexible, and the same line can have multiple meanings, and they're all correct. Okay. So, right, but when God restored Zion, we were like dreamers, right? We were like dreamers, and that line in particular is used a lot, right? I mean, I think whether Yossi Klein Halevi's book about the four soldiers in that iconic picture of the four soldiers in front of the Western Wall in 1967, right? That book is called Like Dreamers, right? It's a reference to this line, okay? And please, and again, because I'm doing a share screen, I can't see everybody. So, if you're sticking up your hand, I may not necessarily be able to see you. So, just jump it. Okay. Verse 2. Az yimales chok pinu ulshonenu rina. Right? Our mouths shall be filled or were filled with laughter and our tongues with songs of joy. Okay? Classic example of parallelism, right? Yamalis chok pinu, our mouths shall be filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy, right? Parallelism, therefore poetry, right? Az yomru vagoyim, and they shall say among the nations, Higdil Adonai la'asot im ele. Adonai has done great things for them, right? The people who went back to Zion. Higdil Adonai la'asot imanu, right? God has done great things for us. Hayinu semechim, right? We were joyful, right? Simcha, right? Chag Sameach, right? But here, this translation says the Lord will do great things for us and we shall rejoice, right? Again, that theme of like, you'll deliver us and then we'll praise you. I mean, so I think it was worthwhile to have that little introduction because now you can see stuff in here that you might not have seen before, right? But that theme of, redeem us, we will praise you, right? So the Lord did great things for us and we rejoiced. The Lord will do great things for us and we will rejoice, right? Shuva Adonai et shivitenu, restore our fortunes, Adonai ka'afikim banegev. Okay, like it says, like water courses, we say like streams in the Negev. Okay, now question. Why does this simile make sense, right? Restore our fortunes like water courses in the Negev.
Well, the one I'm reading says, Lord, return our banished ones as streams return to dry soil.
Okay. All right, so, right, return our banished ones, not a bad translation either. Could even say exiles or captives, right? As streams return to dry soil, because Negev, I mean, the Negev is called the Negev because it's dry. Okay, so a towel in modern Hebrew is called a magevet. Okay, and to dry something is to linagev. So you linagev with a magevet. Okay, so that's why the Negev is called the Negev, right? But what does this have to do with streams or water courses? Okay, today we would call that a wadi. Okay, we call it a wadi in Hebrew, we call it a wadi in English. Wadi is actually an Arabic word. What is a wadi? A wadi is a dry riverbed that turns into a river when it rains. Okay, which it does not do very often in the Negev. Okay, and every year people are killed in wadis, either because they're camping and they decide that the wadi is a good place to camp, um, because it's protected, which it is protected until the wall of water comes down, right? And actually, when I was living in Israel, my great aunt died, and a couple of my friends, and I lived in the Negev. A couple of my friends drove me to the airport, and they almost got killed on the way back because they were like, if in the Negev, the roads don't they don't have a bridge over the wadi. They just go down and through the wadi because 99.5% of the time it's dry, right? And if the wadi floods, you just stay where you are until the flood is over. But they happened to be driving through the wadi when the wall of water came down, knocked the Jeep over, almost drowned them. Um, I didn't find out about that until I got back, but it wasn't my fault. But so now that you know that, right? So restore our fortunes, restore our captives, like a water course in the Negev. It's like it was dry and now it's full of water, right? It was dead and now it's blooming, right? Just like the dry bones, right? A similar metaphor, right? So, you know, talk about our hostages, right? Right? There are 59 unaccounted for, of whom we believe 24 were still alive. Trump gave a press conference yesterday and mentioned 21 still alive, right? Does he know? I don't know, right? I hope he's wrong. I hope there's still 24, but it's not unreasonable, right? And because what's clear to me is that, and what is clear to the families of the hostages is that the Israeli government has given up on them. That's it. They're done. They're not coming back. Let's pursue other goals, right? 70% of the Israeli public does not agree. But whatever. I mean, again, contemporary, always contemporary relevance, right? But I mean, when the other hostage deals were made, they were made suddenly that nobody expected, right? So, restore our captives, our prisoners, our hostages, like water courses in the Negev, okay? Hazorim Badima Barina Yitzuru, right? One of my favorite lines in the whole Bible. Those who sow in tears shall reap with songs of joy. Right? Now, why are they sowing in tears, right? Because you still got to sow, right? I mean, it's hard for us to relate to this because we're not farmers, right? Right? But even if, you are completely overwhelmed by grief, you still have to sow your seeds, right? But those who sow in tears shall reap in joy, right? Hazorim, but I mean, I get overwhelmed just reading this verse, right? Those who sow in tears, shall reap in joy, right? Or as Pope Leo XIV said this afternoon in his first address as Pope, he said, among other things, um, God loves us all, and evil will not prevail. Right? God loves us all, evil will not prevail. And you have to believe that. If you don't believe that evil will not prevail, I don't know how you go on. Because Hazorim Bedima Barina Yitzuru. We sow in tears, but we will reap in joy. Right? And then a similar theme in the last line. It's a very short psalm, it's only 6 verses. Haloch Yelech Uvacho. He goes along weeping. All right, and this Haloch Yelech, I don't want to spend too much in this, but this is a poetic form that shows emphasis, right? Because haloch yelech, and then later in the same verse, bo yavo, right? So it means it strengthens it, right? So haloch yelech uvacho. All right, though he may go along, though he may walk and cry, he goes along weeping. No say meshech hazara, he goes along weeping, carrying the seed bag, the bag of seeds. Bo yavo verina, he shall come back with songs of joy. No say alumotav, carrying his sheaves, right? So there's, right, no say and no say, carrying and carrying, right? Those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. Then the parallelism, he's walking along, sowing while he's weeping, carrying the seed bag, but he's going to reap with songs of joy, carrying his sheaves, right? And I think you can see why, right, this was such a popular song, right? Because it expresses the hope for redemption, right? And that's why it is, to my mind, both future and past tense, right? Because not only do we hope for redemption, we know that God will redeem us. How do we know? Because he did it once before, right? So, right, the past points to the future, right? And, since particularly Birkat Hamazon, right, is tied to thanking God for the land, right, which makes sense, right? Because if we don't have land, we don't have food, right? I mean, again, we don't think about that because we don't get our food from the land. We get our food from Wegmans, right? But where does the food in Wegmans come from? It comes from farmers, right? It comes from farmers. But so Birkat Hamazon is tied to the land. This is tied to the land, redemption, etc., etc. Very, very short psalm, very beloved, and very beautiful, I think, and very, like, to me, like, in times like these, right? Whether we're talking about times like these here in the United States or times like these in Israel, very hard to hope, right? Because, right, if you put your trust in political leaders, you will be disappointed. Right? But if you put your trust in God, you will not be disappointed, because what God did once, God will do again. And so this, but again, you see some of the themes in the Psalms pop up in this psalm, some examples of parallelism, some examples of metaphors or similes, and so that's it. Questions, comments?
How did the sons of,
I just wanted to tell you that in Siddur Sim Shalom, there
Yeah.
is a list, a page listing all of the Psalms in the book with their page numbers. And that's at the end on page 873.
Right, in the full, in the old one.
Really,
Yeah.
in about 58 of the Psalms.
Yeah, I mean it's extremely useful, right? If you want to see, how a particular psalm works in liturgy. I mean, it's not a substitute for having a Tanakh, because, as it said, there are 58 psalms in the Siddur, and there are 150 psalms in the Book of Psalms. So, yeah. But that's certainly so. Thank you for pointing that out, and that is definitely a
At least
useful
we can get
tenet of,
started.
yeah.
how did the sons of Korach make it in? Because Korach led a rebellion, right?
They did teshuva, I guess. Right. I mean, look. It says that the descendants of Haman taught Torah in Bnei Brak. I mean, so if the descendants of Haman can teach Torah in Bnei Brak, the descendants of Korach can write psalms. I mean, it's nobody is irredeemably evil, I guess, or just because they are evil doesn't mean their sons can't, do good.
And let me put in a pitch for studying the Hallel as a group. I'd like to do that. Having been in
Okay,
shul a
sure.
number of times when they're sung,
Yeah.
how do they operate as a unit? Why were they chosen?
Wow.
Why do we do
Okay.
why do we do the full complement sometimes and not other times?
Right. Okay.
Okay.
I mean, that's a different question.
Oh, yeah,
But
yeah.
I mean, and the answer, Frank, is just to make it a little shorter. But
Right.
but it does sort of screw it up, because like you're reading several psalms in order, and then all of a sudden you're skipping half of a psalm.
Mhm.
It works in terms of accomplishing the goal of making the Hallel a little bit shorter on certain occasions, but it does kind of mess up the literary unit and the continuity. Yeah. Okay. I mean, if everybody's okay with that, we can look at Hallel the next time. Great. All right. Marcia, nice to see you. Hope you're well.
Yeah, Marcia.
Hi,
Congra-
everything's okay.
Congratulate-
It's nice to join you.
Right.
It's good to see you.
Congratulations on your fellow Chicago in the Pope.
Oh,
And,
my.
I'm trying to figure out if he was a Cubs
And,
fan or a White Sox